All right. So this is the Willamette Week endorsement meeting for the Multnomah County District Attorney. I think we should just start with the quick bio from each of you, who you are, where you're from, why you're running. Mr. Knight, why don't we start with you?
No, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, obviously, for having me today. I wish this was in person, but this is the world we live in now. My name, obviously, is Ethan Knight, and I'm running for Multnomah County District Attorney because I love this community. I grew up here with my mom in Portland, went away to school, came back, started practicing law in 1999 at the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office, and spent roughly 8 years there handling essentially everything they do. I was in the community prosecution unit and then spent most of my time prosecuting robbery and homicide cases, as well as environmental crimes. I left that office in 2007. I went to the United States Attorney's Office, where I've been ever since. And there I've handled predominantly national security cases. So international terrorism, domestic terrorism, counterintelligence, but also I've done public corruption and violent crime as well. So that's my legal experience. And I was a supervisor in the DA's office years ago, but I've been very active in the community during that time. Currently president of the Oregon Law Foundation, which moves money into legal aid services around the state. Was previously the vice president of the Oregon State Bar and on the board of directors for the Boys and Girls Clubs of Portland. All of that really has animated my thinking now more than ever of the importance of having someone who's independent, has credibility in the legal community, and understands the nuances of the criminal justice system. We'll get to this shortly, but when we talk about why I'm running, and the really fundamental reason being my love for this community, I see the biggest public safety need is our need collectively to better address the low-level offenses in the community. I hope and plan to continue a lot of the, I think, candidly progressive work that Mike Shrunk started 20 years ago and Rod has worked on over the past 5 to 10 years. But more than that, I think it's about reacting to the needs of the community, but being an independent voice for public safety. And lastly, I just want to say, because I think this is an integral piece, or should be, of our discussion, obviously the COVID-19 crisis will change, anyone operating in the public or private space in the coming years, particularly public safety. And I think that that is something to be mindful of when we talk about, what works, what doesn't work, and how we're going to navigate what will be a social and economic crisis, in my mind, for the coming years. So that's it. Thank you.
All right. Mike, same question to you.
Sure. So yeah, thanks for getting together and talking to us today. I'm running for DA because, quite frankly, I think we need major reform now in our criminal justice system. I got my start, my bio. I was a high school teacher in New Orleans. It was my first job out of college. I taught in the public schools there for a couple of years. I went to go learn about our education system, and I learned a lot about our criminal justice system. In my school, my students were largely Black, almost all of them actually, because the school systems there are still very segregated. And I got to see through my students' eyes what it was like to have to go and learn when you have been the victim of a crime, when you have been witnesses to crime, when your parents are incarcerated, and sometimes when you become a defendant yourself. And I saw some pretty up close negative stories about that. So I went to law school in Portland to Lewis and Clark in 2005, and decided I'd study criminal law. Got a internship, started off as an intern in the district attorney's office in 2007. And once I graduated, was hired on by then DA Mike Shrunk, prosecuted in that office until 2013. During that time, handled mainly property crimes, property felonies, misdemeanors, did drug court work, worked on a project to improve getting victims of crime restitution. That was something, there was a Secretary of State's audit that said that we were failing in that area. So I headed up a project to fix that. And while I felt like I was having, helping people and doing that, I didn't feel like I was really changing anything. So I got out in 2013. I went to the legislature as counsel for the Senate and House Judiciary Committees. Worked there in the 2013 session. Went back to the Multnomah DA's office for just a brief stint, and then got hired on by the Criminal Justice Commission to implement what was then House Bill 3194, the Justice Reinvestment legislation. So that started my career at the Criminal Justice Commission, and within a year or so, I was the director that hired me, had left the agency, and I was appointed by Governor Kitzhaber to be the director of that state agency. I've been the director ever since, so I took over officially January of 2015. In my time as director of the commission, we've dramatically improved the transparency of our criminal justice system in terms of data and analysis. Some of our reports have been reported on by the Willamette Week and in many news organizations. And we have dashboards available to the public where you can go on and see arrests and convictions and incarceration rates and slice it and dice it by all kinds of ways. We've really been a leader in the entire country on increasing transparency in those statistics. But we've also worked on a lot of different criminal justice reform bills, legislation that the legislature directed us to do. We've looked at cash bail, racial profiling. We are the agency in charge of implementing a statewide racial profiling network to be installed in all police officers' cars. We've worked on drug possession reform, dropping it from a felony to a misdemeanor. So all kinds of different reform legislation. We largely are a research-driven and numbers-driven agency. So that's the role that we play. And so, when I looked at DA Underhill not running again, I thought, my experience have both having been in the office and driving a caseload, understanding what that's like, having been through that, but then getting out of the prosecutorial role and working across state sectors like the health sector, foster care, and seeing how the criminal justice system really can impact all those other places, a lot of times in unattended ways. I felt like my experience really would be a great person to be able to take data and research, look at criminal justice reform responsibly in our community and across the state, and take what I've learned from my work outside prosecution.
Great, thank you. So, Mr. Knight, the Multnomah County DA PAC has endorsed you and given you $25,000. Portland Police PAC has given you $10,000. My question is actually for Mr. Schmidt. Why do you think these two groups have thrown their support behind your opponent instead of you?
Yeah, some of the stuff that we've talked about already. I'm running on a major reform platform. I've talked about how I'm against the death penalty. I've talked about how I'm against cash bail. I've talked about police accountability and the necessary role that the district attorney plays in that. I've talked about mandatory sentencing laws and how I believe that those need to be changed. So I am running on a pretty progressive reform agenda. So it's not surprising to me that the folks who are working consistently or currently in that system, change is a scary thing. So I think that's pretty much the driving force there is, the status quo kind of folks working. They want to keep going the way they want. I want to change the way that we do business.
Okay, and Mr. Knight, same question to you. Why do you think those two groups gave you their support rather than your opponent?
Well, I think it's because they understand that I have the credibility and experience to lead and navigate in a complicated system in a complicated time. And I'll just say, dovetailing on what Mike said, the reason that the District Attorneys Union endorsed me was not because I think they're afraid of change. At least if you look at the letter that was publicly released, they talk about how I'm really the best candidate to implement many of these progressive changes because of my understanding and ability to work within the system. And they talked about the reason for that is my broad experience and understanding of the system. So I think that has a lot to do with it. And I think those two endorsements underscore the fundamental difference between us, which is, Mike's done a lot of great things in Salem, but it's fundamentally a political background, and mine's a professional background. And, I believe this job and those endorsements demonstrate the need to have a professional in this position.
So can I pipe in here? This is Mark Sussman. Mike, can you speak to that a little bit more? I'm specifically interested in the DA's endorsement. You said, you're a reform candidate, and that explains why they may not have endorsed you. If that's the case, how does that bode for your management of the district attorney's office, given that it sounds like you're reform-minded and you think the people who would be working for you aren't?
Yeah, I think ultimately, I am running on a pretty progressive change platform. So they have decided that they are more comfortable with supporting Ethan. But ultimately, this is a race that's decided by the voters. I have a lot of respect. It wasn't that long ago that I was in that office. I believe 7 years ago, I was in that office. I still know and have contact and am friends with a lot of folks who are prosecuting in there. Have a lot of respect for what they do and they care deeply about public safety, as do I. So it's my hope that if the voters who are really for the first time in decades faced with a real chance to decide where they want the criminal justice system to go, if the voters decide to back my platform and myself as the candidate.
Yeah, but I'm sorry, help us out a little bit here. What specifically about your reform package do you think has the DA's union so up in arms?
I think
you're not proposing to cut their pay.
No,
and you're not proposing to lay them off.
No.
So if it's not their economic survival they're worried about, what's the most important distinction you think between your view and their view of the world?
I think the biggest thing, all the candidates appeared in front of the prosecuting attorneys union, so they got a chance to really ask us a lot of questions. Their questions that I think I took away that seemed to draw the most contention was my position around Measure 11 and shifting sentencing back to judges making decisions rather than prosecutors, essentially. That would change things. And quite frankly, and I understand this from their perspective, they're looking at their caseloads. They're saying we're already one of the thinnest offices in the entire country at 9 FTE for every 100,000 citizens in this community. And they're saying if you take away that power from us, that leverage, we're going to be going to trial. That's going to increase our workload. So for me, that was, I thought, what the biggest policy difference was in contention.
So you think it's just that the DA's union does not want to return a degree of judicial discretion to the courtroom?
Yeah, I've heard that from quite a few of prosecutors, both in the office and around the state as well.
Ethan, you want to speak to that?
Well, again, I can only speak to the letter. It doesn't discuss Measure 11 explicitly, and I think if you were to candidly poll the membership there, they would not say that was the driving, motivator behind their endorsement. There are probably folks there who obviously support it. And it doesn't, at the end of the day, affect workload that much, right? I mean, I think what they're thinking about, at least what I gleaned from the questions I received and what I've heard, and it may indeed be different from what Mike's seen, is they want someone who understands the true nature of the work, who can give them the kind of credibility and support they need in the kinds of cases that they handle every day, and who candidly has handled those cases, and will go to bat for them in a neutral and detached way, separate and apart from the political system. And at least what they've said publicly is that I'm the person to do that. So Measure 11 may be a factor there, but it's certainly, at least what's been stated publicly, is not the driving factor.
So Ethan, let me ask you this. I know the U.S. Attorney's Office takes its orders from the Justice Department, and for many years, the U.S. Attorney's Office, the orders were, counterterrorism. And you really, on a statewide level, don't really get to set much of the agenda about where your prosecutors spend their time. Obviously, that's completely different as a district attorney. So in terms of the focus, in terms of where your DAs will be spending their time as opposed to where they're spending their time now, can you just give us a little sense about how you'd back away from prosecution of X and spend more resources on investigating Y?
No, absolutely. Well, I think, when we start analyzing that question, we have to look at where Multnomah County is right now and what they have the ability to do. State prosecution is primarily a reactive process. In other words, you don't have the luxury of selecting, a tax fraud case and spending 2 years investigating it, depending on whether or not the IRS has done good work. It is indeed what the police bring into the door and your ability to handle it. Right now, that office is at capacity, essentially. I mean, if you look at the case counts over the decades and the DA population, the relative metrics, they have a lot to do. So that's all to say, there really is not a lot of space to say, go do X and go do Y without more resources within what they currently do. And that's just the reality. Now, having said that, let me tell you my priorities and what I would like to see more of. And this speaks to what I said when we initially started this. I would like to see more energy devoted toward the community prosecution side of the house. I mean, that was a program that was initially created roughly 25 years ago when Mike was the DA. I helped create the community court program downtown 19 years ago. And the model was predicated on the idea that you needed prosecutors and police to be truly active in the community, almost prophylactically dealing with problems. And so I would like to see more of that. I'd be willing to commit the resources internally to the extent they're available to do more work within the community prosecution space. And that really would speak to the roughly 70% of cases in that office that fall into the low-level misdemeanor and felony space. So that would be the number one priority. You know, the second would be to focus on those types of cases, the hate crimes, the domestic violence, the sexual assault with vulnerable populations that take more time and resources. I mean, the reality is prosecuting and investigating a sex offense against somebody who's homeless takes extraordinary work and time. So I would love to see more resources devoted there. But to frame all of that, I think we need to be intellectually honest about what that office has the capacity to do. And that's with limited resources right now, and that is react to what comes through the door. And I think obviously with my background and knowledge, I'm the best person to manage that sort of crisis triage situation.
Okay. Ethan, I have a question for you. So you were the lead prosecutor in the Bundy case, which resulted in an acquittal. We obviously don't need to relitigate that whole thing, but I would just want to know.
Yeah.
Sorry? Oh, yeah. Should voters see this outcome as being reflective of your prosecutorial abilities?
No, that's a great question, a fair one. Well, I mean, let's first look at that case. There were 26 folks charged, and 19 were convicted either through plea and through the second trial or the first trial. So we had acquittals in the first trial, then 4 individuals were convicted at the second trial we went to. You know, I've handled in my career, I've tried maybe 100 cases. I've handled a lot of big cases. And the reality is, any trial lawyer will tell you, sometimes you lose big cases. It's not ideal. But if voters want to know if that's reflective of my abilities, I would say my career is reflective of my abilities. And I would certainly invite them to look at the other cases I've handled or talk to judges or other lawyers who see me in the courtroom or look at the awards I've received nationally and locally for the work I've done. But let me also say on the Bundy case, because it's a fair question, because I think people look at that initial acquittal and think, you know, what happened? You know, I will say, you didn't ask this, so I probably shouldn't give the answer this way, but the biggest mistake I made in the handling of that first trial was really a failure to recognize, I think, the anti-government sentiment that was sort of percolating or present at the time. You know, the job of a trial lawyer, certainly in those large cases, is not only to be the most prepared person in the room, but it's to have an appreciation for the optics. And I did not fully appreciate that sentiment that I've alluded to, that anti-government sentiment. So if voters want to know what that means for their next district attorney, it means 2 things. It means I'm uniquely situated, really, of anyone nationally, to confront right-wing extremism in a way that most people who have prosecuted anything anywhere in this country are not. And the second piece is, you know, I've been through a lot of big battles and tough ones, and I'm ready, frankly, for anything that gets thrown at me as the elected district attorney. And that's what they should take away from that case.
Since you touched on that, I'd like to ask both of you, how do you feel like you're uniquely qualified to confront right-wing extremism? Let's start with you, Mike.
Sure. So, you know, I've been working on this issue at the statewide level, working on legislation. I'm on the Attorney General's hate crimes task force. I was part of writing legislation that got passed in 2019 to start tracking hate crimes around our state in a unified way, but not just hate crimes, but also hate incidents. I'm really proud of and excited about that work, quite frankly, because I think the hope is that once we start to coalesce that data, we can start putting together patterns and practices and start seeing hate, violence, even suicides we see these things when they show up in a community, they tend to spread almost like a virus. And so I think tracking those things in a data way will show us what communities are being impacted, where we see things. And sometimes, to be frank, Oregon has some of the strongest First Amendment protections in the country. And so some of these things aren't going to rise to the level of crimes, but they are still hate incidents. And that's why it's important to track that distinction and say, okay, this could be indicative of something happening in this community. How do we work with community groups like Portland United Against Hate, like Unite Oregon, who are going out to their folks, their networks, and asking them for this information to be reported? And then how do we use that data to make sure that those folks are being safe? So I think I'm in the best position to capitalize on that work, both because I've done it at the statewide level. I've already built the connections with those communities to continue doing that work, working together to share information, and then to work together to see how it is that we can go into those types of situations and break that up. I have been talking with, will continue to be talking with national experts who train on how a lot of these right-wing groups, really what their playbook is for trying to embed themselves and ingratiate themselves to local law enforcement, how that's a strategy that we need to call out and just be proactive. So I think really my strength lies with the networks and the relationships that I've already forged with communities that are really impacted. And quite frankly, those groups are endorsing me in this race. Because they see that work that I've done and they trust in my ability to continue.
Okay, Ethan, same to you.
Well, as a prosecutor, and of course that is what the role of the district attorney is, there are really two ways to address right-wing extremism, on the enforcement end and the prosecution end. On the enforcement end, and this is largely a Portland police law enforcement issue, but it bleeds into prosecution. The kind of sort of right-wing extremism we've seen in Portland that I think has impacted citizens really needs to be managed from a crowd control understates it, but it is a management of those folks who are coming into the city really to disrupt and harass people and to scare them and intimidate them. I mean, that's fundamentally what terrorism is. And so the question becomes then, what do you do? And I've talked about this extensively, both on the website and with groups, and I've lectured nationally on issues related to domestic terrorism over the last decade. You need to work with local and federal law enforcement officials in advance to set clear expectations, because on the criminal side, these are really First Amendment questions, or they bump up against the First Amendment. So the question on enforcement ultimately becomes one of, what can we do to limit or contain speech that may be hateful in a way that's still legal? I mean, that really is the threshold question. And so you need to understand and know the second piece of this, which is the legal tools or the prosecution tools to implement or enforce that vision. And obviously I'm intimately familiar with those personally, but that becomes a question really in those situations where you have, for example, a group that comes and threatens individuals, based on political ideology. You need to ensure that your DAs and the police bureau know in advance what's in the toolbox to deal with that specific crime. Is it, we're making arrests for disorderly conduct? Is it this sort of menacing hate speech is problematic? And the last piece is, and this is really a nuts and bolts piece, you really need a joint federal and state effort to manage those discrete right-wing extremism matters when they pop up in the community. And I won't belabor the point, but obviously I think I'm best suited to do that. The community stakeholders Mike mentions are exceedingly important, but the question really speaks to what can the district attorney do? And I'm uniquely situated as much as anyone anywhere to do the most to address that problem.
Okay. Actually, I'd like to follow up on that, but we can start with you, Ethan. What do you view as the district attorney's role in handling protests and crowd control? Like, how is that? How do you work with that, or what's your role in that situation?
It's twofold, and by way of background, I'll tell you, I don't know if many folks were around for this. I actually handled the May Day protests roughly 20 years ago. They were some of the first we had in Portland. So I've lived with these headaches for most of my adult life, for better or worse. And so what the DA's role is, again, it's really twofold. I mean, it's sort of an advice role with law enforcement, because a lot of times you have advance notice and you know how these protest situations emerge, and it's striking that balance with, you know, allowing freedom of speech even if you don't agree with it. And that gets into the role of the DA really being a neutral supporter of the rule of law, and then having in your toolbox and being ready to address criminal conduct swiftly and with clear boundaries and expectations. You know, we missed that, I think, in the first couple protests over the last 2 years, and then the one in August of 19, I think, was more effectively managed because the police and the city went into it with clear expectations. I mean, that's kind of what you have to do. You need boundaries and parameters. And that was one of the mistakes, frankly, in the Bundy case. I mean, we let those guys go on and off the refuge repeatedly without clear expectations, and it makes it much harder than to tell someone their conduct is criminal. I mean, that's an aside, but it informs my view of how you manage these types of situations.
And Mike, same to you. From your perspective, what's the DA's role in managing protests? And also, can you explain a little on how your view on that differs from your opponent, if it does?
Yeah, I mean, you know, a lot of the things Ethan said is coordination, you know, having a plan and being a part of that. But I think where I differ maybe somewhat is when I've looked at some of the cases that have been covered by the Willamette Week and other papers in our community, and you see the kind of cases that are being tried. I just saw a woman who was, I think the headline was twerking in the intersection, something along those lines. And the jury acquitted her of that, right? Which to me was not the fact that maybe technically the district attorney was not correct on the law that she was impeding traffic, but it just shows you that the district attorney has a large role in deciding where the office's resources are going to be placed. And my guess is, without having talked to the jury, that they simply acquitted her of those charges because they thought it was a waste of time and resource. I think that's exactly the kind of role that a district attorney can play. I'll give you another example. There was a protest of students that were marching on environmental issues, world global warming protests. They left their high schools. And a couple of students happened to be a couple of the only Black students in a large sea of young people. Were hanging out in traffic, allegedly. And that they were told by the police not to do that and ordered back into the sidewalk. But then it was after the fact, after they had no longer been in traffic, that the police officers came in behind them and made arrests. I don't understand what the point of that is, or prosecuting those cases are. I mean, it's no longer, they were no longer in the way of traffic. So what is the point of tracking them down through a crowd to make those arrests, when we know that if you look at an entire protest of hundreds of students, they weren't the only ones doing that? So I think that's where a DA can really show some leadership, is say, you know, I have to make resource decisions in my office, and I have to understand what are the cases that I really truly need to bring, you know, for our community, for public safety, and what are the cases that I don't need to bring, and that really, you know, maybe the arrest itself is all the intervention that was necessary. You know, so it is a little bit of deciding, you know, what is really a good use of our time in our communities, jurors' time, judges' time, resources.
Okay, and while we're on the topic of resources, Mike, I know that you have plans to prioritize addiction counseling and mental health care and to increase wages for prison labor. I'm wondering, how do you plan to actually fund those programs, and do you think it's feasible to do all that?
Yeah, I'm not sure about I mean, I think the wages in prison labor issue, I can't remember taking a position on that, but you know, making pennies for an hour, I think, is problematic. And especially, you know, I got to visit the prison in Louisiana called Angola, which was a plantation, a slavery plantation. And then seeing it as a prison, you could see the roots of slavery and how that has developed into some of our prison institutions. So I think it is problematic when people are working for pennies, but funding that, quite frankly, I think would be exceedingly challenging. On the treatment side of things, and that, you know, that's exactly what I've been working on at the state level for the last 6 years. So it started with justice reinvestment. and the idea that the state was on the precipice of building a new prison, which was going to sign us up for $250 million just to have it built, and then $100 million to operate it over the next biennium to get it staffed up and everything else. And the legislature and the governor fundamentally said, that's not a good use of our resources. We rather make investments in the community. And they started off with a $15 million biennial investment into programs, into community programs that prioritize exactly what you said, addiction and treatment resources over prison, which it's exceedingly more, it's way cheaper and it's more effective. So you do the cost benefit analysis on that. And you can find the resources to prioritize treatment. Now, it comes at the expense of using other resources less. And in this situation, using prison less. There's a corollary to the state hospital. It's an incredibly expensive resource. I believe I've seen numbers over $1,000 a day to send somebody to the state hospital, when outpatient assisted treatment can be accomplished at a fraction of that. If we took some of the money we were putting in the state hospital and gave it to communities to do that work in an outpatient setting, I think not only could we also achieve better results, but we would find more resources for our community to make investments in those things. So it's, I think we have to look at where are we spending our money right now? And then are there ways where we can reduce the spending in those areas? So in prison, in our state hospital and other areas, foster care systems and other places. And can we take a fraction of that money or some of that money and invest it into community programs? So that's the work that I've been doing for the last 6 years. And as a DA, I'd be a vocal proponent of looking at different alternatives of how we could spend the resources we have even better. And Ethan's absolutely correct. And we all know it. The world that we're walking into, at least for the next few years, if not a lot longer, is going to be some very serious budget constraints. So I think having that experience and that ability and understanding of all the different complex funding streams that flow into our public safety system, from the city, the county, the state, the federal system, those are all funding streams that I've worked with and quite frankly, am endorsed by most of the people that control those.
Thanks. Ethan, do you want to respond to that at all?
Well, a little bit. I mean, speaking to the budget generally, I will say that, the budget will be and has been a significant issue for the district attorney's office. And there's no panacea. I mean, this notion that somehow there's either money coming from somewhere else, it's predominantly county general fund money. And I will say, a lot of those folks, all of them are endorsing Mike, but they've routinely cut the office, and all of them to a person have said publicly, many privately, that they are willing to cut it more and are not supportive of public safety. So that's where I differ. I mean, I'm ready to be an advocate publicly for the reality and the need for more money in that office. And, as an aside, and I suspect Mike and I agree on this, but there's, I think, a bit of an illusion about where these treatment programs fit into the criminal justice system. Years ago, I supervised the misdemeanor intake section of the DA's office. And it was much cheaper and faster on the district attorney end to send a DA into court with a stack of files and say, get 30 days of jail on each one of those. Systematically, it's more expensive. But if you're talking about DA's time, then to have these treatment programs where you rightly need to have someone go into court half a dozen times to have someone take their medication. But what's happened politically, in my view, is, this notion that treatment is in the long term cheaper has been used basically to paper over cuts in the office. And, it's time to stand up and say that's not how this is going to work. And if the public wants to make a choice about what the priorities are, that's fine, but it shouldn't be a false choice. And that's kind of my view on the budget. I mean, I fully intend to be an advocate for the office, and that's not about locking people up, but it's about, we need to have public servants who can work effectively within a system that's under-resourced, and the public will have to make choices. But I'm ready to be that advocate. I mean, I'm not running for this job, and I'm not interested in simply acquiescing to the status quo. I mean, that doesn't really interest me. So that's where I see the budget falling down.
Okay. So now I think it'd be great if each of you could ask your opponent a question and make it a question of substance, please. So how about we start with you, Mike? You can ask Ethan a question.
All right. Sure. So let's talk about COVID-19. It is something that I think we're all going to be dealing with. I've come out and said that prisons, like jails in our community, like nursing homes, are places where social distancing is not possible, and that you cannot physically do it. So I've said that we should be looking at options to decrease folks in our prison system to get as close as we can to being able to comply with social distancing, so that we can stem the tide not only of for the protection of the people who are in our care and custody in those institutions, but for the frontline workers who are doing that job and going back into their communities. There's been some voices critical of that, the Oregon District Attorneys Association, the DA in Washington County. So I'm just wondering, Ethan, what's your take? What would you advocate for if you were the DA in this situation? Would you be a voice? What would your voice say?
No, great question, because it's a relevant one given what we're confronting right now. So first of all, I would support what Rod Underhill in that office has already done, which is assisted in decreasing temporarily the jail population by roughly 20%. And there was a Washington Post letter to the editor, I think 2 days ago, that alluded to Multnomah County's success in doing that. Where I would probably break, candidly, from the ODAA on this issue is I would support going forward reviewing these on a case-by-case basis. I do not support, when we're talking about corrections writ large, simply saying we need to let 20% of the folks go out of our correction system, to pick a number, because it helps improve social distancing. Because I know in the system right now, there aren't even probation officers to help watch these folks. And when we talk about the importance of reentry, you've got to do it right. And so what I would support is something similar to what we're already doing in the federal system, and that is examining these cases on a case-by-case basis. We have motions for compassionate release that are filed by the defense, and you can evaluate the efficacy of the motion, a person's medical history, and decide whether or not someone really is appropriate to release at this time. And so that's something we should do from both a public health perspective and a public safety perspective. So I believe in a balance. I mean, I think, and that's sort of my approach generally to public safety. I mean, you can't just say no, but you can't just say yes, absolutely all the time. So that's how I'd approach it.
Okay, actually, I did want to follow up on that. I mean, some people say that doing that on a case-by-case basis during the pandemic is too slow and wouldn't actually stem the spread of COVID-19 in prisons. How do you feel about that?
Well, it's slow if you make it slow, right? I mean, it depends what you're dealing with. If you've got a sex offender who may pose a viable threat to the community, who's not actually infected, then you're doing a cost-benefit analysis and you're weighing those risks. And you know what? That's what our court system and our judicial system is for. At its best, is weighing and assessing risk. And that's what our responsibility is collectively as public servants. So to those who would say that doesn't work, I think basically that's just a way not to acknowledge and not to confront the difficult choices that come with having to go case by case. And there's a way to do it too. I mean, look, the Chief Justice could appoint the presiding judge or a judge in each county to be the one to triage these motions. I mean, that's how some jurisdictions handle these acute judicial crises. So there is a way to do it. And I think that's how that would be best handled.
Okay. And Ethan, you can ask Mike a question now.
Oh, okay. So Mike, you've talked a lot about transparency in the course of the race and the need for data and transparency, both at the district attorney level and a lot about the data that you've worked with at the Criminal Justice Commission. And so I guess if you could just explain how voters should put into context with that, the article that ran in Willamette Week yesterday that talked about your agency's failure to comply with a statute that really effectively supports a nonpartisan and balanced criminal justice commission. I know there was a comment by your office in there yesterday, but just help me understand if transparency is important, how do voters reconcile a failure to comply with the lawful requirements of your agency?
Yeah, great question. I think that was one where it seems like we missed the ball on that. Quite frankly, nobody on my commission realized that was an issue. Not my commissioners, not my Republican commissioners. not my Democrat commissioners, because we don't really operate that way. The work that we do on data and research and funding programs, the commission almost always comes out unanimously on their votes. So it really hasn't been an issue. And, you know, when commissioners, the way the process works, they apply to the governor's office for appointment. And on that application, I believe one of the questions is, what is your party affiliation? And so either somewhere in that vetting process, we either just missed the fact that we had more Ds than we were allowed by statute. Excuse me. But, you know, it's something that's easily rectifiable. And so I know that we'll be working on getting that situated so we're in compliance with the law. That's always important. You know, and I just say, you know, there are checks throughout the system. Obviously, as the director of the agency, I have a role in that. There's a process in the governor's office for vetting applicants. And then the Senate confirms all of our commissioners. So, you know, I mean, I think all along the line, a bunch of us just missed that fact that we had 5 Ds instead of 4. You're only allowed to have 4 from the same party. We had 1 more than that. So yeah, now that it's brought to our attention, it'll be swiftly fixed. And you know, I think the way the last 2 commissioners were appointed, one was Rod Underhill from from district attorneys, and one was Jesse Camphy, who is a public defender. And essentially, you know, the way that we approached those appointments was we reached out to ODAA and we said, who would you like to have the governor consider for appointment? They put up Commissioner Underhill. And we did the same thing for OCDLA, asked them who would they like to put up for appointment. They said Commissioner Camphy. And so they went through the process. You know, obviously, when both of those commissioners filled out their paperwork, maybe we missed, you know, verifying what their party affiliation was. And I can tell you that's a mistake that won't be made again, and we'll do everything we can to get it fixed.
Hey, Mike, I just have a fact question. The Criminal Justice Commission, what's the size of the staff?
We have some temporary employees, so I think we're at 25 right now. It's right around there. I think fully biennial funded FTEs is maybe 23, but we have a couple temporary.
And how many direct reports do you have?
So right now I have.
You're on leave right now. But.
Yeah, right. So the way my structure is set up is I kind of have 3. They're not really deputy directors because we're so small, but 3 people that report directly to me. One is in our programs side of the house. Right. One is in our operations side of the house, so budget, HR kind of stuff. And then one is in our research side of the house. So I work most closely with them.
So it's 20 or so employees with an annual budget of?
Annual, because we do biannual in the state, but annual will be $45 million.
Okay, and how does that compare to Multnomah County DAs, both in terms of personnel and budget?
Budget, it's actually about the same. My understanding is the Multnomah DA's budget is also around 40 million, 45 million, right around there. So budgetarily, it'd be the same. Personnel, the office size, I believe, is closer to 200 with about 70 attorneys and about, I think, 120 or so administrative staff and some other folks. So
this is a bit of a departure, but that raises the question, what are you doing with all your money since you're not hiring employees?
Yeah, I could be hiring a lot more people. You know, a lot of our money at the commission goes to fund programs throughout the state. So we are the largest funder of drug courts, mental health courts, justice reinvestment program, things like that.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Could I just ask a quick question?
Go ahead, Nigel.
So, Ethan, maybe I missed it, but could you tell us whether you're for or against the death penalty? And also, since you raised the issue of the Criminal Justice Commission's partisan makeup, could you also weigh in on whether you think the Criminal Justice Commission has done a good job, or whether, as some prosecutors think, it has pushed the criminal justice system too far to the left?
No. So first, with respect to the death penalty, so here's my view. I mean, first, it's the law in Oregon. So, and that's important because, you know, whoever the DA is, in my view, has to follow it. Now, as a practical matter, of course, the way the law is currently constructed, I don't think we're going to see another death penalty case in the state of Oregon anytime soon, barring, you know, the perfect storm of facts, quite candidly. But I'll tell you, I do support the death penalty in limited circumstances. I mean, it's, probably the worst position to take in Multnomah County. But that view is informed by my own personal experience. Years ago, I prosecuted and tried an aggravated murder case involving a serial killer by the name of Sebastian Shaw, who decapitated a paraplegic man and killed a number of others and raped a woman. And I think going through those facts, it led me to believe that there are times, difficult times, when a society has to make the tough decision that sometimes death is an appropriate sentence. It was easy for me to almost be not glib, but not appreciate the severity of the sentence before I handled that case. And so I do think there are rare times when that is an appropriate sentence to consider. Now, having said all that, whatever the voters choose in the state of Oregon to be the law, obviously I'm going to follow that, because that's my job as a member of the executive branch. It's not to pick and choose those rules. It's to follow them. So speaking then to the CJC, I candidly would describe maybe the outcome is mixed. I think Mike's done a lot of good work, but I also think that if you look at the actual metrics in the last 4 years with respect to crime since justice reinvestment has been implemented in Multnomah County, there are some issues. I mean, property crime has skyrocketed. We now have the third highest rate of auto thefts in the United States. Recidivism has increased. And, there's probably a debate to be had about, the correlation to the work CJC has had in that. And it's probably a little of both. I mean, the truth probably lies in between, in all fairness. So I think that the problem, though, when you have a state agency that's been operating really with a political mandate in many respects, is there's a disconnect from what's happening in communities. And this gets me back to what I said at the beginning. I'm running because I love this community, and I'm concerned about what I see outside on the streets when I talk to people and when I talk to people from all different backgrounds. And so when we talk about what is the effective way to run a district attorney's office, it relates to what you can do in the community. So that's kind of where I come back to, where does that agency fit into what's happening here in Multnomah County?
Thank you.
Okay. All right. I think we can do any of my other colleagues have follow-up questions that they want to ask? No? Okay. Well, now's the time in this call when we do our fun question that we've been asking all of our candidates. So what is one sort of unusual or memorable thing that you've done during this quarantine that you'll remember for the rest of your life? Mike, we can start with you.
Yeah. Boy, wow, right? This is a different time that we're in, and there's been a lot of odd things. I think, if there's a silver lining to a situation where a lot of people are experiencing a lot of tragedy across our community and the country, I've gotten to spend a lot of time with my kids. So I'm on family leave right now because I have a 2-month-old, and we also have a 3-year-old who wasn't supposed to be home with us right now while we were spending time with the 2-month-old. So that's it's been necessary for that. But the other night, my 3-year-old and I went on a camping trip together, where I put a tent up in our backyard and we slept underneath the stars, all 6 of them that we could see from Portland. That was a really special moment for me to be with him out there. And then we froze our butts off all night because I didn't put the cover over the tent because I wanted to see the stars. But that's a moment that'll stick with me for the rest of my life, spending that time with him.
Awesome. Ethan, same to you.
Well, I mean, I think in part, spending the time with my wife and my 2 boys, and not just spending the time, I think, all being here, I'm trying to listen more. I know that sounds pretty prosaic, but just to try and understand where people are in this moment and the people I love and why it's hard for them. I've got 2 teenage boys, and I think it's tough. And the other thing I'm trying to do, and I don't know if this will be memorable or not, is I'm finally reading Harlot's Ghost. I kind of figured that if there was ever a time for 1,300 pages of Norman Mailer, this is it. And it may be the last time that I spend this much time reading Norman Mailer. So that's kind of what I've been thinking about lately.
Great. Well, thank you both so much for taking the time to do this. Our endorsement issue is coming out on the 29th, so you'll be seeing the outcome of this then. So thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Take care.